All right, so whether you guys are here because you want to be or because you have to be, we're all sort of hoping for the same thing. We're hoping to learn something. But you guys ever wondered how people learn? Well, intuitively, you can say that you learn something when you're able to remember it. But in that case, how do people remember anything? Well, the cognitive theory tries to explain this by dividing memory into 3 different aspects: sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. Now, sensory memory is simply the physical representation of information held either in your eyes for visual information or your ears for audio information. And at this stage, you don't really do much with the information other than to relay it to your working memory. Now, your working memory is a store that holds all the information that you're currently aware of. So anything that you're thinking about right now is being held in your working memory. But the working memory is more than just a store. It is here that information is processed semantically. And this is an active process that integrates all kinds of information and puts it together into a single representation of your current environment. And finally, there's your long-term memory, which holds all the information that has already passed through your working memory. Now, you're not always aware of everything in your long-term memory, and in order to use that information, you have to bring it back and retrieve it into your working memory. Now, it's this relationship between passing information from working memory into long-term memory and then being able to retrieve it later that results in learning. So that all sounds easy enough. You just think about something enough, pass it into long-term memory, and then there you go, it's learned. But in reality, learning is more complex than that. And especially when you're trying to learn multiple things at once, you might find yourself overwhelmed. And that's because learning, like all complex processes, requires resources. So in terms of the cognitive theory, these resources are located in your working memory and are used up by active processes like storage, retrieval, and integration. Now, that translates into a limit into the amount of information that you can access at any one time. And it's your allocation of these resources that determines how effectively and efficiently you're able to learn something. But I want to point out that learning isn't simply storing. To learn some piece of new information, you have to be able to transfer it into long-term memory, but then integrate it with knowledge that exists there already in a meaningful way. So you can think of this like doing a puzzle, in which each piece of the puzzle represents some new piece of information. So you can take all your puzzle pieces and then just throw them onto your table, which represents your long-term memory, and then all your pieces are stored. But now later, when you go back to get a specific piece, it becomes incredibly difficult to get it out of this big mess of information. And in some cases, you wouldn't even know if the piece is even on the table to begin with. But if you were to take each piece and put them down individually, connecting related pieces as you went, then when you needed to retrieve a specific piece, all you have to do is pick up the larger segment that it belongs to, and now not only did you find the piece that you wanted and did it quickly, but you also have a multitude of related information that results in a more clear understanding of the big picture. And this is meaningful learning. But think about this. What if I were to give you a 500-piece puzzle and tell you to complete it in an hour? Most of you probably wouldn't be able to do that, and instead would be overwhelmed by this task. And the same thing can happen when you're trying to learn information. If you're presented with too much information in a relatively short amount of time, you may meaningfully learn some of it, but most of it will probably end up in a big pile at the end of your table. And this is because you've already used up all your cognitive resources learning that initial little bit of information. And this is referred to as a cognitive overload. Now at this point, people would probably decide to give up on the puzzle. But I don't want you guys to be discouraged. Know that there is hope, and I'm going to leave you guys with a few pieces of information, some tips and tricks you can use to help reduce your cognitive load. Now the first is pre-training, and this is simply exposing yourself to the information before you have to learn it. And that can be as simple as reading a textbook before going to class or doing some background research. Next is segmenting, and that's just breaking up the material into smaller, more manageable pieces. And you can do this physically, for example, studying on a chapter-by-chapter basis, or temporally, for example, studying 2 hours a day for 4 days rather than 8 hours all at once. Third is aligning, and this is simply organizing and studying your material based on relevance. So since you integrate and recall information based on relevance, by packaging all that information together, then it becomes a lot easier to integrate it, and you spend less resources focusing on where to put it and more resources putting it there. And finally, there's weeding, and this is just weeding out unimportant or irrelevant information. Now this one is more of a practice skill that takes some time to be able to do effectively, because deciding whether something is unimportant or irrelevant is actually quite difficult and can end up increasing your cognitive load. But with enough practice and when you become fluent at weeding out information, you'll find that it not only saves you resources, but time as well. So while learning is a really complex thing, it's something that we all have to do at some point in our lives. And while understanding how people learn is a good first step to becoming an avid and successful learner, the most important step is application. So some of the tips and tricks that I gave you today are a good place to start, but the truth is everyone learns differently. And the only way to understand how best you learn and retrieve information is to practice. So go out there and practice. And who knows, if you try hard enough, you might actually learn something on the way. Thank you.